Welcome to the Ukraine Today newsroom. My name is Steve Brese, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Andrew Wilson. Andrew is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, an expert on Eastern European politics, specializing in Ukrainian politics, and a reader in Ukrainian Studies at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at the University College in London. He's also a member of Ukraine Today's brand new International Supervisory Council. Welcome, Andrew.
My pleasure.
So, as a Ukraine expert, does that mean all questions about Ukraine are fair game?
Yeah. I teach courses in Ukrainian history, Ukrainian politics, so far away.
Very good. All right, well, first off, Ukraine and the crisis in the east of the country has sort of dropped out of the mainstream media on a daily basis. We now only see it when something dramatic happens. Do you think that's, is that troubling to you? Do you think that's dangerous for what's happening here? Tell us your thoughts.
If you mean the Western media, then yeah, sure. I mean, we have all sorts of problems. One of oversupply. Too many media channels with too little to talk about, and kind of attention deficit disorder. You know, we focus on whatever's bright and shiny, telegenic, you know, important stories without TV pictures to go with them. We tend to ignore as well. So yeah, the story is always moving on, particularly if it's a long story. Euromaidan was what, 94 days. You know, so the Western media is constantly looking for a new angle, otherwise it loses interest. And Russia knows this and can exploit it. I don't know if Russia is clever enough to keep us uninterested. Russia also kind of restores our interest sometimes by the things that it does.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Why does Russia want to distract us? Why does Russia maybe want to distort some of the information that might be coming to Western audiences?
Well, it wants us not to intervene.
And us being?
The West.
Okay.
And our politicians, you know, they consume our media, you know, in our kind of modern media-driven democracies. You know, they care about what the media is saying, and if there is a storm, a media storm, a desire to intervene, then that will affect decision making. Clearly that's what happened last summer with MH17. I don't think we would have got to the kind of unity on the level of sanctions against Russia that we do have without that. So I guess if Russia is cynical enough, it tries to keep below that tripwire. Which actually constrains, in some ways, what it can do in East Ukraine. You know, marginal offensives, I beg your pardon, you know, are its modus operandi to keep making extra gains. You know, whereas all-out offensive would probably actually make us wake up.
Lots has been happening in the past weeks and months. Can you just help us refocus a little bit? Talk about what is happening right now in eastern Ukraine and what's Russia's role in that?
Well, there's way too much debate in the West still about the degree of Russian involvement. We know that it's permanent. We know that it's at some levels in terms of command and control has been permanent since last spring, more or less. But it's also variable. Russia sends in extra troops when it has particular tasks in mind, you know, for the Debaltseve or the Ilovaisk offensives. But the West sometimes treats that as, you know, Russians appearing ex nihilo. You know, it's an increase in the Russian presence, so we ought to treat it as such. Obviously, there's some combination of locals and Russians and volunteers. But the Russians are always there. And this wouldn't be happening if that were not true.
I want to talk to you a bit about a book that you've written. It's called Ukraine Crisis, What It Means for the West. Two questions. Talk to us a little bit about the title, because I know you're not thrilled with that title. And what does it mean for the West? What does the crisis in Ukraine mean for the West?
Well, the first half of the title was the publisher's choice. And to say I'm not thrilled, you know, I know what they were thinking. You know, in marketing terms, it's kind of a sensible choice. It's the brand. It sells books. But I didn't want to say, like many others have done, that this is an existential Ukrainian crisis. A lot of people have blamed Project Ukraine for being fundamentally flawed. They've looked at Ukraine as a kind of entity that can't survive, that has existential problems. No way do I want to say that. So the Ukrainian part of the crisis was always a crisis of dysfunctional politics. That's what people were protesting against.
You're talking about people on Maidan protesting against, dysfunctional politics here.
And as is well known here, that was an attempt to change that political system for the better. And one of the terrible things that we don't know is what would have happened without Russian intervention, because there's a lot of interesting prep that went into doing things better second time compared to the Orange Revolution. The dysfunctional system had prevented people changing it, and so people were better prepared to make that attempt this time. So it's a crisis around Ukraine, and it was a crisis of dysfunctional politics, not the kind of existential crisis that some people have tried to pretend exists.
What kind of Russian propaganda do you think has made its way into Western media, maybe Western mainstream thinking?
Well, there is actually a contradiction within this propaganda state, because the way that Russia operates at home and the way that it operates abroad are very different. At home, the point of propaganda is to mobilize people, and there's a kind of single narrative that Russians are encouraged to believe, whereas abroad, the point is rather different. Partly it's to spread confusion, so that we don't know or we can't decide what's happening. But it's also nudge propaganda. There are left-wing forces, right-wing forces, separatist groups, even Islamist groups. All of those already exist in Western Europe. And Russia's kind of nudge propaganda gives them a bit more oxygen or a bit more conviction or publicity in the case of RT. Which is, of course, you put all that together and it's completely contradictory, but Russia doesn't care.
They might not care, and they're using this nudge propaganda, as you call it. Is it effective?
Well, in terms of exploiting the kind of splintered sphere of public debate in the West and making it more splintered, it's effective. In terms of exploiting a certain, postmodernist sensibility, everything is relative, that all narratives are equally valid, so it's very difficult to get to any kind of objective truth. That can be exploited. Oh yeah, and thirdly, obviously you can't act. You can't decide on policy unless you decide first on fact. Mm-hmm. And the West is kind of stranded, really, at phase one. It's still debating, what ought to be fundamental truths. Russian invasion, Russian involvement, Russian aggression. We don't use those terms as much as we should.
And which international bodies should be using those terms?
Well, the EU debate is often disabled by this search for facts on the ground, whereas the facts on the ground, frankly, ought to be pretty clear. The debate within certain member states, it's equivocal where it shouldn't be. Particularly within France, Germany, Britain, key member states.
Why is that? Why can't they decide on what the facts are on the ground?
Well, partly Russia is very skilled at exploiting other preoccupations, anti-Americanism, for example, blaming America for everything. Also because Russia is skilled at exploiting good journalism, the desire to present all possible points of view as simply points of view, rival points of view. There's actually too much of that nowadays. You don't need to say this is a tank and Russians say it isn't a tank. There are some things which are objective and clear. So we're a bit too journalistic about that. Some things were clear already 13, 14 months ago. We're just way behind the curve.
If 13, 14 months ago the EU, international community, could have decided that, on the facts on the ground, they could have decided that Russia is aiding militants in eastern Ukraine, what should have they done?
Well, generally, it was a huge mistake to rule out military options so unequivocally and so early. Obviously, that was mainly Obama, but key EU member states too. I mean, that's bad foreign policy anyway. You don't tell the other side, what you're not going to do. A little bit of uncertainty is actually quite good in terms of deterring the other side. Uncertainty can escalate, but even in 2008, when the West didn't do much directly to help Georgia, the Kremlin was deterred by uncertainty. It wasn't sure what Bush's America was going to do. And that did stay their hand a little. Whereas Putin has had the luxury of knowing that we're not going to intervene this time.
So do you see hope in the European Union? Do you see hope in American power? Do you see hope in NATO for putting the brakes on Russian aggression? Where do you see hope in this?
Well, there's been some pushback within NATO, but pretty weak, in terms of moving troops, in terms of raising defence expenditures again. There's been a lot of talk, relatively little action. We're too far constrained by the supposed promises in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which, if you look very closely, are about substantial forces not being moved to new NATO members. So there's plenty of scope for doing more there in order to properly defend those NATO members. Still less Ukraine.
Thank you very much for joining us here today, Andrew. Thank you for your ideas and your opinions.
My pleasure, and good luck to Ukraine Today.
That was Andrew Wilson joining us here today in the Ukraine Today newsroom.